Hello there, Mark here with you, Malacandra, as I'm known on Board Game Geek, and thank you to my wife Susan, who's behind the camera. Want to introduce you to the newest GMT Tactical World War II game, The Last 100 Yards, designed by Mike Denson. The Last 100 Yards, again, World War II tactical, squad level, individual vehicles and guns, duking it out in the terrain of France. Post D-Day into Battle of the Bulge area, winter of 1944. I think the missions mainly go from like July through December of 1944. It's a great new tactical offering with a lot of surprising, new, innovative ways of playing this kind of game. Now, I'm a huge fan of tactical World War II games. Love Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, all of those squad-level, detailed, man-to-man actions of the men in the battlefield, the men leading those men and carrying out their missions. Played a little tiny bit of ASL, some of the starter kits. Huge fan of Combat Commanders, probably my favorite game. Love that one most of all for the narrative it tells, the story it generates with each battle, how battles go down tensely to the last minute. Enjoy Combat Infantry from Columbia Games, Lock and Load Tactical, especially as they have a lot of games in the modern era. But just really love the genre and was super excited to P500 this game from GMT, The Last 100 Yards. How does it play? What does it look like? What do you get? Let's take a look. Well, first of all, it's different from other tactical games in that the designer, Mike Denson, says that he's trying to model small unit behavior. And one of the things about tactical games is you always have that God's eye view. I mean, you're obviously looking at a map and everybody knows more or less the position of their own units and the enemy units. Sometimes there's hidden units and concealment, and that's present in this game as well. But how do you simulate, or at least try to make a game out of, the chaos of battle, random things happening? I always see ASL and Combat Commander pitted against each other as if they're complete opposites. Like ASL, you have total control, and Combat Commander, if you don't have a card, you can't do anything, and so on. But the truth is, in both those games, all kinds of different die rolls will give you all kinds of different events and things that happen, and so on. And no tactical game gives you perfect control of your units. But in The Last 100 Yards, you are constrained to think more like the units would in combat, and that's taken care of, or that's simulated or modeled by the action and reaction cycle. That's the heart of the game. We'll get to that in just a bit. But what comes in the box? You got a bunch of units, great components, maps, all the stuff. Starting with the rules, of course, well organized, well laid out, well indexed, as wargame rules generally are. Not difficult, but difficult to grasp just by reading them. I went through the rules a couple of times and I'm like, I don't know if I'm getting exactly everything that's going on here. But once I actually set units up on the map, began playing the game, following the sequence of play very carefully, going carefully through the steps of all the procedures like fire combat and assaults and so on. Then after doing that a few times, as you begin to speed up, get the process down, suddenly you realize this game is smooth. It's fluid, it plays fast, it plays quickly, and most importantly, and this is probably the mark of any great war game, but especially tactical games, the rules and the system kind of get out of the way and let you focus on the actual map, your units. All right, here's my guys, here's my weapons, here's my assets and resources. How do I accomplish my mission? And so the game is less about figuring out, okay, now how do I do this thing, as it is, how do I actually accomplish this objective with my men? And that's where the game really shines. If you're interested in the game, if you're learning to play it, play through the sequence carefully. Follow each of the steps. Don't think you know what the next step is or anything like that. Just play through it carefully in sequence. Follow the steps, and before long, those steps are second nature, and the game is just flying along, full of action. So the rule book, it's well done, answers questions, is detailed. Then there's also a playbook, which is a supplement to that and really helps a lot. It's illustrated. It's got all kinds of illustrated examples of different rules and mechanics in the game, and a nice section by the designer on his notes, designer notes. They talk about his historical research and the things that he's trying to accomplish with the game. I always think that helps anytime you're learning a new game, what's the designer trying to do here? What's he trying to convey? What's he trying to model with the way he's designed the game? The game comes with a great set of player aids, nice double-sided large player aids. Here's your terrain table, assault, combat, fire values, all these sorts of things. And then this is some commonly used rules, rule sections, pretty much cribbed straight from the rule book, but handy reference to the things you're going to be using in the game. And the best part is there's 2 sets of them, so each player has their own set of player aids. Makes it super handy. 12 maps, and they're really well designed. They're really nice. They're very clear, easy to tell the terrain types. What's sort of interesting about them is you can maybe see here a little bit. There's hills, as is common in tactical games, but there's also contours on the hills themselves. And so those actually play a part too, not only in the levels, but also in line of sight and so on. So you've actually got a little bit more nuanced terrain around the hills rather than just you're on level 0 or level 1, but you've got some actual hill contours, which again play into some of the tactics and strategy of the game. You kind of try to move around, keep the hill between you and the enemy, cool stuff like that. So there's 12 of those maps, along with 12 scenarios, or missions as they're called in this game. Those are all nice color cards, and there's even a nice system for designing your own scenarios or designing your own missions. A series of charts and steps. And I think that's pretty cool because in Combat Commander, for example, you got the random scenario generator, which lets you make oodles of games, well-balanced missions, in addition to historical scenarios. So a do-it-yourself generator, design your own generator, in a tactical game means you've got all kinds of possibilities for creating cool new battles and missions, other than the ones included in here. Now, these are pretty varied, and with multiple different maps. So, you know, the first one, a nice single mapper, and then you got this big 4 mapper that's in there, and a 3 mapper, and all this kind of stuff. So, lots of varied missions and objectives and so on. But the ability to design your own right out of the box, super cool, super helpful, is going to add to the replayability of the game. You got the nice game track board, which keeps track of casualties and time. We'll get into that in just a little bit, and has the sequence of play so both players can see it. Great components, nice thick cardboard. The main units are 3/4 inch counters, good firm cardstock. You've got American units. Again, we're doing France post D-Day, so you got the Americans, you've got Germans, you've got a whole bunch of improved positions like foxholes, you've got the smoke markers, concealment markers for both sides, control markers for objectives, smoke, regroup, and a variety of play markers. These are for keeping track of motion on vehicles, assaults, whether it's the Americans assaulting or the Germans, the direction of the assault, all kinds of markers for actually playing the game. And then these colored markers, which are the fire resolution. Okay, green is small arms, red, mortar fire, and yellow, anti-tank. So we'll talk about those. I don't know if we'll get to mortars and anti-tank in this video, but maybe we'll do another video at some point if we feel like it talking about those. So, how does it play? What do you do? What's different? Well, the first thing is, the heart of the system is the platoon activation cycle. Now, I've played a lot of tactical games that talk about platoons, but there aren't any that I know of, other than perhaps Columbia's combat infantry, where the actual organization of the unit is essential to the play. In Last 100 Yards, units are organized in their companies and their subsequent platoons. So take a look. This is the German 2nd Infantry Company. Now, it's the 2nd Infantry Company because it's black. That's indicated in the rule book, as opposed to the red numbers, or the red background on the numbers. That's the 1st Infantry Company. Same like over here with the Americans. These white back numbers, that is Baker Company, as opposed to their red back markers, that's Able Company. There's also platoons of tanks. Here's a few of the Shermans. There's some of the, I think those are Panzer IVs over there. Maybe is that a Tiger maybe? And then a variety of other units. There's light anti-tank weapons. There's machine gun sections. There's an 88. There's half-tracks, trucks, fortified positions, American half-tracks, American machine guns. There's a 57mm anti-tank gun, and so on. So a variety of units. So all the stuff you'd see in battle on the front. So But the core unit is the company, and the company is divided into 3 platoons. Take a look. So again, this is the 2nd Infantry Company of the Germans, and each company divided into 3 platoons. So you got 1st platoon, 2nd platoon, 3rd platoon, of course, indicated by the numbers there. Each platoon has a platoon leader and 3 squads. Now, a squad is 2 steps of combat units and could be deployed into 2 sections, or we might say in another tactical games, half squads, something like that. All right, so those can be deployed there. What's kind of interesting about the game, what's kind of neat, is whenever you have to select units, you always select them randomly because their stats can all be just a little bit different. So if I deploy this squad into 2 half squads or 2 sections, I'm not sure exactly what units, which units I may end up with. Of course, you can recombine them into a squad and so on. Same thing with like machine guns. If you have, there's a whole bunch of different machine guns. So if it says you got to set up your group with 1 machine gun, then you would randomly draw that. So you're not exactly sure. So some are a little bit better cohesion. Maybe they can handle fire a little bit better, and maybe even a little bit better assault firepower, things like that. So there's some nuances and differences in the units themselves, which make the game interesting, and then also make you think about, okay, which guys are going to be best for trying to accomplish this objective. Do I want these guys firing? Do I want these guys moving in for the assault to cover that last 100 yards, which is really where the name of the game comes from, and so on. But the heart of the game is the platoon activation cycle, and the platoon activation cycle is unlike other tactical games, because in most, for example, in ASL, one player does all the stuff he wants with his units, and of course the defending player, the opposing player, gets some interrupts. There's defensive fire and that sort of thing. Or in Combat Commander, I do a few things with the cards I have, you do a few things with the cards you have, and so there's a lot of back and forth. In Lock and Load Tactical, I activate a hex, maybe some adjacent hexes, do stuff with those units, and then it's your turn. You do the same, 1 or possibly more hexes, but it's back and forth. 1 hex activating at a time. In the last 100 yards, only the player with the initiative gets to activate his platoons and carry out actions with them. So let's say Susan is playing the Germans, and I'm playing the Americans. If she has the initiative, and so she has the initiative, she can activate her platoons to carry out actions. My Americans can only react to her actions. So if she does something with one of her squads, then I can do something with one of my squads if they saw that squad act. And then if she has another squad that saw my squad do something, she could react to that. And so back and forth in a series of reactions, reacting to each other. But it's the initiative player that's sort of setting the pace and tempo of the game. Now often, the attacker will be the one, typically every mission is divided between the attacker and a defender, and the attacker will generally start with the initiative. And so they're going to set the pace and the tempo for the game, but if initiative changes hands, then suddenly you might stall for a few minutes, and then the other player is going to have sort of the upper hand and be able to sort of dictate the pace of the action. So we'll kind of take a look at how that works using an example of the first mission in the game. In order to do that, let's take a look at the mission. We'll kind of see how the basic way that a mission is scored. So this is mission 1. It's essentially some Germans coming in off the board, and they have to take some territory to end the game. Now, in last 100 yards, the way you determine victory is through the score. So each player is trying to achieve a score. Typically, it's the attacker who's being scored, and the lower their score, the better the better they're doing. Okay, so if you look at this here, a score of 0 to 35 is going to mean the Germans win. If it goes up to 45, it's going to be a draw. So you can get to a point where, like, well, I don't think I can win it, but maybe I can still play for the draw. And if it gets to 46 or more, the Americans are going to pull off the victory. So what is this score? Take a look at the casualty track and the time track. During the game, each turn, the clock is going to advance. And this is based on a die roll that the initiative player makes. Whoever has initiative will make that. So anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, this time track is going to advance. Your score is going to be whatever the elapsed time is when the game ends, plus or minus these numbers on the casualty track. Typically, the attacker in this first mission is the Germans, and then the defenders are the Americans, have a casualty differential limit. if the casualty, so every time someone takes a casualty, this marker is going to move. So if the Germans take a casualty, it's going to go this way. If they take another one, it's going to go this way. But then the Americans take a casualty, it goes that way, and so on. If the casualty marker ever passes your differential, you're going to lose the game automatically. Otherwise, wherever it ends up is going to modify the score of the game. So let's say, for example, that the Germans, it's 37 minutes into the game, and the Germans have to take 5 of these wooden buildings on the map in Mission 1. They have to control 5 of them, which basically means getting a combat unit in there, and this church. Right? So let's say they've done that. Let's say the Germans have gotten their 5 buildings, and they've gotten the church. They following the sequence of play, they'll make another time roll to see how much time has elapsed, but then the game is over because they've accomplished the objective. So let's look at the clock here. So let's say the clock is at 37 minutes. All right? Let's say back and forth in the game, the Americans have ended up with 1 more casualty than the Germans. So that puts the casualty marker over here. So what you do is you take the elapsed time, 37, minus or plus, but here it's a minus 4, would leave us with a score of 33, which just enough to win for the Germans, who need a 35. 35 is their max. So that's the basic way that the missions are scored. Now, there can be mission objective points. There can be other things that happen. There can be ways in which you have to control portions of a road or particular buildings and so on. So, and actually, having played through about half the missions so far, the actual objectives are pretty varied. So, I mean, every game is not exactly the same. But this basic mechanic of the score is how you judge the scenario and see who wins or loses. So, having said all that, let's sort of take a look at how this whole sequence of play works. And again, as you're learning the game, just walk through the steps. Do it slowly at first, and then as you get familiar with it, it really becomes second nature, and the game will simply fly. So, for this scenario, we have the German 2nd and 3rd platoons from their 2nd Infantry Company. So we're going to put these guys, we'll put them off to the side for now. And so these are the guys, and they have a machine gun section. So say that's the guy we randomly drew. Here is our German options. Now again, when we play, we always pull out all the half squad, the sections, to kind of stack them. That way we have them ready to randomly draw in case one of our units takes a casualty, and we got to replace it with a section. Of course, there might be reasons to deploy too, so you've got a couple extra units to go running and split a squad and go around, flanking maneuvers and cool stuff like that. The Americans are going to use their 2nd platoon, so we'll just kind of move these guys off to the side, take our 2nd platoon, and they also have a machine gun section, randomly determined, of course, is this guy here. So, in the game, there is the use of concealment. Concealment is when units are moving around and the enemy hasn't yet identified exactly who they are. So, since I got my machine gun, got an infantry squad, and so these units are concealed. Now they could move up here, and if the Americans were far enough away, the Germans would not lose that concealment marker. Now the Americans could fire at them and say, all right, what's under there? And the Germans say, well, it's 2 infantry and a vehicle or something like that. So there's constraints on that. There's also criteria about when these concealment markers are removed, but it gives enough of an advantage to the defender that it's kind of neat the way concealment is handled. So, if you get within a certain distance, you'll lose that concealment marker. But it's an advantage. You can kind of sneak through the forest, and the enemy's not exactly sure where you are, and so on. Now, in this scenario, in this mission, the Germans don't come on concealed. But there's a portion towards the end of each turn where if a unit is out of sight of any enemy units, you get to put concealment markers on those units. So again, they sort of lay low and they're out of sight, and then they can sort of move cautiously until that concealment marker comes off. The game also provides for hidden units. In this particular mission, all the American units are going to set up hidden. And that just means marking, who's in what hex on a piece of scratch paper, so they're not actually on the board. And again, there's certain criteria that the rules give for when those units are revealed. But in this demonstration, I'm not going to mess with the concealment, not going to mess with the hidden units, just to get some units on the board, maybe somewhere in the middle of the mission, and show you how the heart of the game, the platoon reaction and activation and reaction cycle works. So let's take a look. we'll put some German units on the board here. We've got 2nd platoon, and we've got 3rd platoon. All right, so let's put this machine gun. Let's say he's gotten up to here. And let's say these 2 squads are over here. Put them in this hex with Lang, their platoon leader. Okay. All right. And let's say this guy is over here with one of his squads, and these 2 squads happen to be over in this building here. All right. Now, there's some stacking limits which are laid out for you on the player aid card. Essentially, you can get at least 3 squads and an MG, you can get a couple vehicles. You can get a lot in the hex. But you want to be cautious because even though you're not overstacked, you might take a unit density penalty. So you don't want to have, like, if I have 3 squads in there, that's going to be bad for the Germans if they got shot at. So we'll keep it to no more than 2 squads in the hex. Now, again, the Americans set up hidden in this particular mission, but we'll go ahead and put them on the board. Now, what's interesting is, we show these squads. So here's 2nd platoon from Baker Company. 1st squad, 2nd squad, 3rd squad. Now, these numbers down here, that is a unit's cohesion. In other games, it might be called morale, but it's how hard they are to disrupt in this game or break in another game. So what we're going to do is, let's put this machine gun, the Americans have a machine gun, let's put him in the church. Right? That machine gun section in the church, because the Germans have got to get there eventually. Let's put a couple guys here in some buildings. Maybe let's put this guy over here, on the edge of the woods. And maybe he can, as the Germans advance, he can run back and get in the church and make it tougher for them to assault it. Now, where do we want to put Jackson? Well, if the platoon leader has a better cohesion than units it's with, that's generally a good thing. So let's stick him with the squad that's maybe just a little bit more shaky. Maybe that's some of the new guys that came into the company. Okay, so somewhere in the middle of the game, the Germans have the initiative. And here's the sequence of play. The beginning of each turn is the initiative phase, where each player makes a roll for the initiative. Now, typically, the attacker, sometimes the defender, has a initiative die roll modifier. In this particular scenario, it's a +2 for the Germans. That means that if they had the initiative on the previous turn, they can roll with a +2. So having the initiative tends to help you keep the initiative, but not always. I mean, it's a die roll after all, and so these things can swing back and forth. But here we are, let's say in the middle of the game somewhere, the Germans have the initiative on this turn. Let's say they rolled, they added their +2, they beat the Americans. What if it's tied? Well, that'll tell you. The Axis get it if the numbers are odd, and the Allies will get it if the numbers are even. So there's the initiative. The next thing that comes then, and this is the heart of the game, and this is the thing that you have to understand, is the platoon activation cycle. So again, looking at the map, the Germans have the initiative. They have 2 platoons on the board, 2nd platoon and 3rd platoon. Now, the machine gun is not necessarily part of either platoon, but he's with 2nd platoon, so he's going to activate with 2nd platoon. So what the German decides is, do I want to try, I'm going to do everything I want to do with 2nd platoon, and then I'm going to let the Americans react if possible, right? But I might want to do everything I can with both platoons all at once, if possible. So they're going to try to roll for coordination, right? If they roll 8 or better, then they will be able to do all their actions with, say, 2nd and 3rd platoon before the Americans get their reaction, okay? Well, let's say they roll a 3, they don't get to coordinate, so they're going to activate 1 platoon at a time. So Susan says, I'm going to activate 2nd platoon. 2nd platoon's units can do all of their actions. Each unit, every turn, whether it's initiative player or not, every unit can only ever do 1 action per turn. They can maneuver, which is moving around, as well as moving into an enemy hex to assault combat. They can fire, or they can recover if they're disrupted. So, for example, here's a disrupted guy. When they disrupt from combat results, they'll flip over. The red stripe says, hey, they're disrupted. Again, in other games, you might call this broken. So they're disrupted. You would try to recover them and get them back. Also, sometimes after assaults, they end up called regrouping. So everyone's kind of discombobulated after the assault. So they also, even though they're not disrupted, they're regrouping, and they're kind of limited in what they can do until you recover them and get that regroup marker off. So the Germans can decide, I can do something with each unit, I can do something with some of my units, or I can take actions with none of those units. But regardless,
I do as many actions as I want with those units from that platoon, and then I call for reaction. Now, if a unit doesn't activate when its platoon is activated, you can't go back and activate it later. However, it could react to an enemy action. Let's take a look at how this works. And this is the heart of the game. So, here's our machine gun. Here is this squad. They see this guy here in the woods. It's their turn to activate. They're going to shoot at him, try to put some fire on him, try to disrupt him. They think that there's a danger that maybe he might go back for the church. So let's try and slow this unit down. Let's try and slow this squad down. So we're going to fire. How does that work? Well, the machine gun is going to start by taking a fire action. They fire at the squad in the trees. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our die roll modifiers for small arms fire. All right. Now this machine gun has a range of 12. The range to the target is 3. So I look at my range 12. Range to the target is 3. No modifier. That's good. You'll notice, conversely, that the American squad has a range of 8. A range of 8 at 3 hexes is going to be a -1. Even the German squad has a range of 10, which is still no modifier at range 3. So the longer the range is, the better trained the troops, the better equipment, and so on, is going to have less die roll modifiers. So toe-to-toe at 3 hexes, let's say, the German squad has a slight advantage over the Americans in using their fire. So anyway, the machine gun's going to fire. It's 1, 2, 3 hexes. There's no modifier. It's not split fire, motion fire. You just kind of go down the list. None of these things are necessarily the case, but there is a terrain effects modifier, right? And now on this map, well, on all the maps, but lighter green is woods and darker green is forest. But both of them have a -1 on terrain effects. So the net modifier, the total modifiers are -1. Firepower of the machine gun is a 1. So that gives a net 1 - 1 of 0. And what you do is you take a small arms marker and you put it on that hex. Okay? Now the squad is also going to add its fire in because you want to get as many possible shots as we can. So likewise, with a 10 range capability and 3 hexes, there's not going to be any modifiers. Only the -1 for the woods, which is going to give a firepower 1, -1, a net 0. Now what these markers indicate is, first of all, since they're green because they're small arms markers, and that's kind of easy to show because, well, small arms fire is green on there and you use the green markers. These are the numbers that are added to the die rolls to determine whether there's any damage to the units in there. Now, the density of units is not super large where it gets too confusing, but in case it helps, there are markers, so we say we'll put this marker here to show that these guys fired. Okay, that was their action. All right, so this guy fires, they're firing at this squad in the woods. So now we got these 3 units left of 2nd platoon. What are we going to do with them? All right, well, maybe we want to make sure that that we can, I don't know, do we want to fire with them as well? Maybe we want to try and suppress all these guys and get them damaged so maybe 3rd platoon can do its thing. But if they don't take an action, then they're done taking actions unless the Americans react. Let's give that example. Let's say that the Germans decide to hold these units. So they take an action, and then you say, I'm passing, calling for reaction. Now, normally, you can only react to units that did something in your line of sight. So these units fired. Any one of these American units could see these units fire in their line of sight. So any of these units could react. Now here's the thing. A reacting unit can do any of its actions. It can maneuver and move. It can recover if it's disrupted or regrouping, or it can fire. But the very specific rule is this: units can only react and fire against units that took an action. So let's look at this. Let's look at this example again. The Germans fired on this squad here. All these units saw it. Now this guy could say, "Look, this is getting pretty heavy. We're going to move back. We're going to react and move back into these buildings here." All right. Supposing this guy was disrupted, Jackson can say, "Look, man, you guys got to get it together. So we'll try a recovery and try to get him back." Okay. But if any of these units want to fire, they can only fire at the unit that they saw fire. Now, wait a second, you say. They can all see these guys. They can see, these guys can see these guys can see these guys. And this is where last 100 yards is kind of brilliant in its difference from other tactical games, because in other tactical games, like, well, okay, here's my guys, there's your guys, I can see your guys, you can see my guys, I can shoot at them, they can shoot at me, I can do whatever I want. But here, these guys are only reacting to the things they saw. So they might know those guys are there, but they're only going to fire at the guys that are an immediate threat. So these Germans fired, they're the ones that are going to take fire back. Otherwise, all your reactions are going to be like, "Oh wait, these guys fired. We saw it, but you guys got to, get it together so you can recover." Or, "Hey, let's bug out and get back to these buildings back here," and so on. Okay? So, let's say now that this squad here is going to put fire back at them, because that's, you know what, these guys are pain, and you got this machine gun, and it's bad. So they're going to return fire. All right? So we got 1, 2, 3 hexes. Look at our handy dandy chart. At 8, with an 8 range squad, 3 hexes is actually going to be a -1. All right? They're also in the woods, or maybe that's forest. That's forest there. It's darker green. So that's a -1. They've been shot at. They have fire markers on them. They have die roll markers on them. They are suppressed. That is going to be another -1. So they're at -3. +1 is going to be a -2. So they're going to put a -2 counter on that hex there. All right. Now, reactions keep happening until I'm done and call for reaction from the Germans. So, she passed it to me. They react by firing. Well, I guess we'll put our fire marker here. But let's get this machine gun in on the action. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hexes at a range 10. Range 10, 5 hexes. That's going to be a -1. All right, a -1 into the woods is another -1, so -2 total, which gives a -1. So -2 and the 1 firepower is going to put that on there like that. All right. Now, so he fired, so we're going to keep track of that like that. You can cock them sideways, or however it's easy to keep track. It's generally not, it doesn't get too overwhelming. Now, these guys could also react. But again, they can only fire at the units they saw fire. Americans are going to be cautious and hold off here and say, "All right, we're done reacting." Okay? Well, these guys fired. We pass it back to the Germans for reaction. Well, here's this squad, and they saw this fire here. Now, I don't think we check our handy dandy line of sight. No, they could probably see those guys in the church. There's nothing blocking it. You'll notice on the maps there's like little blops of woodsy trees and things. Those are incidental terrain and don't actually matter. The only thing that actually matters are buildings, walls, forests, and woods. The roads, of course. The farmland, it's just really for depiction of the terrain and so on, but those don't actually do anything. So they saw them. They too are going to put their fire on this guy. Maybe not this guy, because that's a little bit farther away. That would be a little tougher. But 1, 2, 3, 4 hexes with a range of 10. That shows a -1 penalty. So with the woods, it's going to be -2 total. One firepower is going to be a -1. Let's have both squads fire at them. -1 and -1. All right. Now notice the things going on here. The Germans started this on their activation with these guys firing. So any Americans react to those guys firing. So these guys reacted by firing. These guys can now react, but only to the guys that also fired. Right? So they can't go shooting at other units. So these guys clearly saw them fire, but they don't get to shoot at these guys, because these guys haven't done anything yet. They haven't done an action or a reaction. Okay? And that's the heart of the cycle. There's a couple other things that are possible to do with your units that didn't see the enemy do an action. So for example, the typical one is if I call for reaction, and the Americans, I call for reaction, and the Germans have a platoon leader with some guys, that platoon leader and those guys can do some things. So let's say he's back there broken. Even though they can't see anything, they can still make a reaction. So it's a good time to try and do the recovery there. Or maybe, well, there we go, here it comes down. All right, but maybe they're back here and they need to move up. So since they're with the platoon leader, they could actually make a maneuver action and move up there. All right, even though they didn't see any other action. That's a special case for units that are with their platoon leader, that they can be able to do that. You could also, any unit, withdraw. So these guys aren't with their platoon leader, but let's say it's a reaction. They didn't see any of this stuff over here. They can still run back towards their edge of the board. Now, why you want to do that, I'm not so sure, but there might be situations where you got to get your men back and sort of regroup. But a withdrawal is like sort of a self-inflicted rout or something like that. You move towards your edge of the board and orderly withdrawal and that sort of thing. So there are a few exceptions in which units can react without having seen enemy actions or reactions in their line of sight. But the main thing is, I got to see you to react to you. And I have to, and if I'm going to fire, I can only fire in reaction to you. So you see how the initiative player has the advantage? Because his units are there, he can shoot at anybody he wants by activating his platoons. But the units that react can only fire back at the German units that fired at them. All right? And so that's kind of how the action and the reaction goes. So, Germans acted, they fired. These guys fired back. These guys, the machine gun, fired back. Having seen those reactions, these squads fired back. All right? Now, that's all the Germans want to do. Even though, well, I don't think they could see through the woods there. So Germans are like, we're done, and Americans are like, we're done. So that was the first activation of second platoon. Since the Germans have another platoon, now Susan says, well, now I'll activate third platoon and do some stuff with them. Okay? So, well, just to be crazy, let's say this squad here wants to get some fire in there. So Rolf here is gonna have his squad fire in these guys. 1, 2, 3. So again, at a range of 10, no penalty for the range, but the building is going to be a -2. -2 and a 1. It's going to put a -1 on there. All right. Now, what about these guys? Well, we got to get these buildings under control, so we're just going to go for it. And it's not a particularly good move, but just to show you how the thing works. Right? Units that are activated, platoons that are activated, in other words, the initiative player, infantry units always have 3 movement points. But they can always move a minimum of 2 hexes. So clear is 1 movement point. Buildings are actually 1 movement point. So woods are a 1.5 for infantry. So if these infantry were going to move, they could go 1, 2.5, and of course then they don't have any more movement points, so they're done. Right? They could go 1.5, 3, right? But at a minimum, they can always go 2, no matter what. What you'll see is the movement points really come into play. So if you're going to move your minimum 2 hexes, doesn't matter the terrain, doesn't matter how many movement points it costs. But where that might come into play is, well, since clear hexes are only 1, this guy can make a dash 1, 2, 3 for that building. Okay. So let's say he does that. So they fired, they made a dash. Now the Germans want to wait and see what the Americans are going to do. Well, they're gonna do some shooting because this guy is out here in the open. All right. So this squad here is going to fire. Well, what have we got? Range is 2. That's going to be no modifiers. There's no cover, and the target maneuvered within 2 hexes. Right. There's the penalty for running, for moving and getting shot at. All right. So we're at a +1. Right. And we're going to be at a -1 because he's got a fire marker on him because he's suppressed. So they're trying to fire at them while getting shot by these guys. So you got a -1 from the being suppressed. You got a +1 because they maneuvered within 2. That's going to cancel out to be a 0, which gives us a 1 total. We add the 0 to the 1. And we're going to put a 1 on this guy. I know that was a crazy move, but it kind of shows you how it works. What you'll notice too, and now you're thinking, oh, wait a second. As soon as he moved here, those guys can see him. They should be able to shoot at him. Not quite Not in this game. Now, what Mike will argue, the designer, Mike Denson will argue, is that guys, their rifles may be able to shoot, 500 yards or whatever, but they're going to wait, until they're seeing guys up close before they engage them with, attempt to engage them with effective fire. You can argue that or not, but the way it works in this game is you can't just shoot them as they run. Okay, move in this hex, shoot. Didn't break, I move them again, shoot again. So that's kind of traditional ASL style, combat commander style, lock and load style, pretty much traditional tactical style of opportunity fire. Not how it works in this game. You'll notice that there was a penalty because he moved within a couple hexes of that unit, but if he just moved back here, he wouldn't face that penalty. It's when they get close that they're getting more and more in danger. Okay, so he reacted. So the Americans react to that, and they say, you know what, still going to hold these guys, we're going to pass it back to the Germans for reaction. All right? The Germans are like, well, you know what, this guy saw him fire, they could shoot back, he could move, he could do something, but he's going to stay put, so the Germans are going to pass the reaction. So since the Americans reacted, and they pass it back to the Germans, and the Germans didn't do any actions, they call back to the Americans for more reactions. And remember what we said about platoon leaders and their men? They can still do things even though they didn't see a unit do something in their line of sight. So when the Germans was back to the Germans, this guy stays put. He's not going to react to this guy. So the Germans didn't do anything else, but they pass it back to the Americans. Since he's with the platoon leader, Jackson says, you know what? Let's just back it up a little bit. So he's going to go ahead and they're going to move back into there. And he can do that as an optional reaction. Okay? And then he passes it back to the Germans. Well, the Germans don't have anything else they can do. Maybe they saw this guy. I guess they could see that from there. So this guy could still react, right? But he's going to stay put. So the Germans activated a platoon, did some actions with those units. The Americans reacted. Germans reacted to that. When all those reactions are finished, then she gets to activate the next platoon. So they do something with a few of those units, Americans react, Germans react. When that's all done, that platoon activation is done. And since the Germans have no more platoons, that whole platoon activation cycle is over. That is the heart of the game. That's the meat of the game where you're judging, do I want to use this guy to react? If I don't, I might not get another chance. When do I move? When do I fire? When do I get my guys back? When do I recover? Where do I want my platoon leader to be to try and help guys that are disrupted and so on and doing all these sorts of things? So lots of cool decisions. And again, once you go through the sequence of play a few times, it's going to become second nature and it moves really, really quick. Now, we had all that shooting. We haven't rolled any dice yet. In the last 100 yards, after the activation phase, comes the fire resolution phase. Now, what does that mean exactly? What is that simulating or modeling? Well, the gist of it is that all this stuff is happening simultaneously. People are shooting, people are running, people are trying to recover their squads. It's all just a simultaneous amount of things going on in the few minutes represented by the clock. All right? So the fire then is sort of all taken care of at once. Now take a look at this for 1 second. You'll notice this hex here has got 2 fire markers on it. For small arms fire, you're shooting at the hex. So these markers are going to affect the whole hex. What's going to happen is when we roll, we're going to take those results and apply them to the whole hex based on certain criteria. But what's sort of an interesting mechanic is like, well, I shot this guy, but then he just ran away back there or something, but all the markers are on the hex. Well, the rules are that if any of the units leave the hex, the opposing player gets to decide which markers go on this hex. So let's say the squad, some reason, had reacted and run away that way, even though he had fired. So let's say he had reacted and he's got this marker on him. The Americans can say, well, let's leave the -1 on the machine gun, but let's make sure that -2 stays on that squad, so he's still taking fire. So even though they're taking fire, they're running, it's all happened simultaneously. They might have gotten shot and broken as they ran. It's all kinds of chaos. So you don't know how it's going to resolve. But let's take a look at that. So during the fire resolution phase, so all the platoons are done activating, all the reactions have happened. We go to the fire resolution phase. We're going to roll the dice for the units. Now, the game comes with 4 nice dice. I added lots of red and yellow and green dice because I like to roll dice that match the color of the markers. But we'll just stick to it. So you roll it. You're going to roll the dice for the guys that you're shooting at. So for example, doesn't really matter. But here's the Americans rolling for this guy. That's a +1. So I'm going to roll and add a +1. Look at that. 2 and 1 is 3. Nothing's going to happen. So we throw that marker. So that guy managed to run up there, ducking and dodging bullets as he goes. Well, here's the Germans. Now, we're going to roll here and add a -1. 3 minus 1, that's a 2. It's not going to do anything either. What are we looking for? We're looking for something that's going to be higher than the cohesion of the best unit in the hex. All right. So let's try these Germans over here. Let's make the black one -2. And we'll make the white one -1. Let's see what we get. All right. So 6 minus 1 is a 5, and the 8 minus 2 is a 6. So neither when you do the rolls, you're only looking for the best or worst roll. So the best roll is going to be this 8 minus the 2 is a 6. The 6 minus 1 is 5. So the 6 is better than the 5. So that's like you take the best roll. Each die doesn't do something. So if I rolled, a 10, and I rolled, if I rolled 2 10s, I really have an 8 and a 9. So the 9 is actually going to be the one that you would use. Let's say that happened. Let's make it a 9. I don't want to get into too many tricky situations here. So there's a 7. That becomes a 5. Here's a 9 minus 1 becomes an 8. So you compare that to the cohesion of the best unit in the hex, which in this case is the squad with a 6. The 8 is bigger than the 6, so this guy is going to be disrupted, right? And this guy needs to make a cohesion check. You always want to roll the cohesion or less to be okay. So he's a 2, so he's not going to disrupt. Of course, if he had rolled higher than that, he would disrupt. If you can somehow get a 10 out of the deal, let's say you rolled a 10, and for the sake of example, that was a 0, then you'd have a 10 for the result. A 10 or higher will actually disrupt and break that unit with casualties. So you would come over here, and that's a second platoon guy, or where his half squads go. His half squads are over here. So you would randomly draw one of these sections or half squads and replace it there, and that would be 1 casualty, right? And that's for the Germans, so the casualty marker would be moved that way. So that's how you handle the casualties. But that's not actually what happened according to our fake dice rolls, so we'll just put it back like that. So let's say this guy, we'll say this guy broke. All right. Now, over here, we got a couple zeros. All right, let's see what the zeros give us. A 2 and a 3. Plus 0 is 2 and a 3. How about the -1s? All right, we have a 4 and a 7, which would become a 6. All right, 6, not enough to break him. So all that fire, he holds tight and does not give it up. All right, take these markers off here. All right, let's suppose there was some fire on these guys over here. Just a sort of side note, and again, there's nuances to the procedures, but again, you walk through the steps that explains all this. So let's say we got our 10 here, right? 10 plus 0 is a 10. That's going to break and casualty reduce him. Check this out. If you got the platoon leader in the hex with those units, and that platoon leader has a higher cohesion than any of the other guys in the hex, he's going to make that roll go down by 1. So that's a 9. So he'll disrupt, but he won't take a casualty right away. All right, so good to have Jackson there, keeping his men, keeping them a little controlled under the panic of fire and so on. All right. So there's some fire results. We'll just kind of leave it like that. The next step in the sequence of phase is assault resolution. I'll talk a little bit about assault just to see how that works. Back in the reaction phase with maneuvering and so on, an assault is a maneuver. So if you take a maneuver action, you're going to move, and you're going to move in order to assault. Well, let's put a guy back here. We'll put Lang and his squad. Let's say they made it up this far, and they want to tackle this squad before they get into the church. There are 2 ways to do an assault. If you are adjacent to a unit, to an enemy unit, you can move into their hex, and that becomes an assault hex. So it's Lang's turn. They're acting or reacting or whatever. They move into this hex. That becomes an assault hex. So we'll note what's marked. Now what's interesting is the unit that's in the assault hex cannot really do anything as far as reactions are concerned. Okay? But you can attempt to initiate an assault from up to 2 hexes away. So here's Lang and his men. They want to assault him. What they do is they run up. and they put an assault marker like that. That shows that they're assaulting this hex. Now, that constrains these units to a couple of different things. They can fire, but only at the guys coming at them. They could also attempt to withdraw if they can pass a cohesion check and get out of there, which would sort of negate the assault. The other thing is, if you're coming from 2 hexes away, you could also feint at the last minute and just stop where you are. So sometimes that might be a useful tactic because that pins these guys. Maybe you don't want to actually fight them. But let's say that one way or another, at the end of the activation phase, if nothing happened there, this assault would get moved into there, and just as if they were adjacent, then it becomes an assault hex. All right? So the initiative player will decide what order the assaults are carried.
So what you're going to do is you're going to look at the assault value of the units. That's the number in blue. You can flip to the assault card on the player aid card, the assault side, and then you're going to look at a series of modifiers that are going to be added up for the defender and for the attacker, and then added to their assault value. The assault value is the blue number. And the first thing you're going to check is the cohesion of the actual combat units. The platoon leader is not a combat unit, so you check them. But the cohesion here is going to be tied, so there's no differential. You look at the other modifiers, such as whether they're attacking in a rural hex, or what those things are going on there. You just go down the list, and some of the modifiers will add to the assaulting units firepower. Some of the modifiers will add to the defending units, and then you take the total and subtract the defender from the attacker. So what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a net modifier for the assaulting player's roll. It could be as high as +4 or as low as -4, and they're going to make a roll on the assault table. When they make a roll on the assault table, then you look at the results.
So they roll straight up. It's even. There's no die roll modifier, and they roll a 9. We'll just make it a 9. All right. So 6 to 9, you just simply follow the steps. Again, the first few times you do this, you're going to go through each step individually. If urban assault, okay, it's not, so we don't have to worry about that. Second, both players conduct vehicle destruction attempts. Yeah, because you can overrun and go into assaults with vehicles and men, so everybody gets a chance to try and blow up the tank that just rolled in with your men. And the Germans are particularly deadly because they have like Panzerfaust and things that they can use. But there's a whole table for deciding how you can blow up the tank that ran. That's not a Panzer, but it was a cat. Right? Now, in this particular result, with a 9 and no modifier, the defender must retreat. Right? Well, that's bad for my guys. So they have to go back. A retreat is always 2 to 4 hexes. Now, of course, there's an exception. They could move 1 hex into cover, so they could actually dash into the church. That would be okay. Otherwise, they got to go back 1, 2, 3, or even 4 hexes back to their side of the board. So they could kind of dash this way. They kind of have a cone of retreat options. But they also have to make a cohesion check. So let's say they retreat. Let's say even if they retreat into the church, they make a cohesion check. They roll a 10, unfortunately. Right? They're going to be disrupted and be disrupted as they go into the hex. So the only thing they're really going to be able to try and do next turn is a recover action. Meanwhile, the Germans are here, and we keep going. Disrupted riders and trucks. Well, there weren't any. Check for leader loss. Oh, Lang, you were in there. We're going to roll. It's not a 1. It's not a 10. Lang survived. If he didn't, our platoon leader would be put 7 minutes ahead on the time track. Right? That would be 7 minutes ahead. And he won't come back to his platoon until the time marker would cross where he is on the time track. That really severely limits what the platoon can do. They really can't do anything without their platoon leader on the map with them. So that's another cool effect and shows the importance of those leaders dealing with their men. Finally, for this particular result, it says attacking and defending non-vehicular units that aren't disrupted are marked with a regroup marker. So these guys disrupted, let's say, right? We have that example. But these guys, they're just all discombobulated from the fight, so they get a regrouping marker. And they're going to have to do a recovery action to get rid of that regroup marker. Otherwise, they're very limited in what they can do. They can withdraw, I think, or they can fire 1 hex away and so on. And real fast, since we're talking about recovering and things, a recovery roll is simply a cohesion check. So let's take this guy over here. He's broken. And to recover him, we require rolling a 5 or less. So if we roll a 5 or less, he would recover. Now we can activate Jackson and have him help. So that would be his action for the turn, but that would give a -1 to the roll, which of course makes it a little bit easier to get that 5 or under. Now, if he rolled a 1, he would recover and rally, which means he could still be activated for an action. Normally, recover would be his action, but with a 1, they're like, super got it together, they're ready to go, and they can still take actions and reactions according to whatever they can do. Also, if they roll a 10, they would recover if they're within 5 of the enemy, and they would become heroic. Their cohesion bumps up to 8. They pick an enemy hex up to 3 away, and they have to do an immediate action to charge that hex. So they kind of go heroic / crazy and battle, lust, or whatever. And so there's cool effects like that that are also modeled in the game. Again, I think Mike's purpose is showing small unit behavior. How are these troops actually acting, and how are you dealing with? You're the company commander or combat commander, whatever it is, and so how are you dealing with them in their reactions and so on. Then at the end of the turn, or towards the end of the turn, or after the assaults, we would take care of some mortar effects. Mortars can be placed on the board if you have a forward observer. We won't get into all that, but suffice it to say that mortars also attack the whole hex, similar to small arms fire. And then you can, once your mortar's used, you can try to extend that and keep the guy on the board to call in mortar attacks the following turn, or else he's out, and then you have to try and get him back with a roll. And there's some other mortar stuff there. Then we get to determine the time lapse. So again, whoever's got the initiative is going to roll and make that clock advance anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. And then there are some cleanup steps at the end of the thing. So if there's tanks that are moving, you would take their motion markers off. You would put your platoon leaders back on the map if they were here. If they were off the map and the time marker crossed, they'd go back with their units of their platoon. You can recombine squads. So if you got 2 sections, you want to put them back together in a squad, you do that then. Any units that are not line of sight get a concealment marker. So again, that's a defensive bonus. Reset the counter orientation, or you can pull off the action markers. That's just to remind you that the guys were used. And then you check whether the mission objectives are over. So did the Germans get their 5 buildings plus the church? Then the mission's over. Then we score it. Did the score get so high that if you add it all up, it's like 48, right? In which case, that also ends the game. That would be American victory in this particular scenario. And that's the gist of it. That's the gist of the last 100 yards, the heart of which is this platoon activation cycle. Again, it's slow at first, but if you just follow the steps, just follow the procedures, before long you begin to memorize these modifiers, you begin to see exactly what's there, and the rules really do get out of the way so that you can focus on, all right, here's my guys, here's my squads, here's my sections, here's my weapons, here are my resources, here's my assets. How do I carry out the objectives that I need to do? How do I get the terrain objectives that I need to do? How do I get rid of the enemy units that are on the map? How do I fight? How do I fulfill the objectives that the mission sets before me? Especially if you're the attacker, then you're the one that's setting the pace, trying to accomplish that. And then you try and look at the score, see how much time is elapsing, try to keep things moving, no dawdling. And then you say, well, maybe I can play for the win. You sometimes come down to the wire and you're like, oh, if I can just hold out, then I can, play for the win. If not, I can maybe play for the draw, and so on. And so they're tense battles. Again, great set of units, great set of other assets like guns and trucks and half-tracks and all, and the tanks. The tank battles are fun. There's neat rules for the way that tanks can sort of get caught in crossfire and hit the rear armor, all without having to deal with facing and turret direction and all these sorts of things. The way mortars impact hexes, so like units that are getting pounded by mortars can't really do a whole lot. Just all kinds of ways in which things affect each other, and all that tying in with the actions and the reaction just make this a really, really fun, really, really great tactical game. Hopefully this video will help you sort of get the lay of the land, see what you're doing, and get the process down. And like I said, we might do another video here or there and show some of the other parts of the game. But for now, I hope that's a good introduction to what's a really great new game, really great new system, really great way of modeling the tactical warfare the tactical battles. Great job to Mike Denson and GMT Games for putting this one out. I'm really excited to own it, and I hope that maybe you'll consider picking it up and having a whole lot of fun playing it. So, thanks for watching.